Hey, what's up everybody? It's me, Lex, back at you with another Pathfinder video. Today I'm going to be covering the Influence subsystem in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and this is going to be a little bit of a quicker video than usual. Just want to let you know ahead of time. The Influence subsystem is meant to be used as more of a one-on-one specific variation on the social encounters rules, and it's meant to provide support for people to engage with social encounters with less socially oriented skills as well. It works very similarly to the research subsystem, if you saw my video on that, with kind of tiers of information that you can gain, or tiers of success in this case, that you can unlock. And let me go over the rules real quick for you here. The Influence subsystem says that generally when the PCs need to gain favor with or sway over an NPC to achieve their goals, and just a deception, diplomacy, or intimidation check isn't enough to get the job done, you can use the Influence subsystem in a social encounter. It uses victory points with the Influence action, and it uses social rounds lasting for any amount of time that you determine, depending on the needs of the narrative. With the standard effects for any kind of victory point system, so on a critical success you gain 2, on a success you gain 1, on a failure you gain nothing, and on a critical failure you lose 1. But it also provides a secondary option for people to support their teammates, and this is to kind of round out the skills and make it far more likely that an entire party will be able to contribute, with the Discover action, where in any given round of an influence encounter, you can either influence, attempting to build up those influence points, or discover, which is kind of similar to recalling knowledge in combat. It's useful for learning parts of the stat block that might be useful to your party. I recommend, as general with the as is general advice with the social rules, that you be very lenient with your rulings here, what you allow your party to do, because more than anything, what your party is going to want to do, and what you are probably going to want to do, is allow for the story to move forwards, though, of course, you should also have prepared in some way a way for the party to fail forward if they end up failing an influence encounter. Influence encounters utilize specific stat blocks. These can be for specific NPCs, and I would also mention that they work fine with larger collectives, the same way as the normal social rules work. They have a listed set of pieces of information. We'll get into it a little bit deeper when we get to the examples that I have prepared for you, but it lists their perception and their will DCs, because those are just relevant to social encounters. It has discovery, which is different DCs to discover information about them that might be able to aid in further influence. Influence skills, which lists the DCs to build up influence points. Influence thresholds, which are just like the research thresholds in the research subsystem, where as you pass these thresholds, you gain effects towards your eventual goal. And then, because usually you'll be interacting with a individual or a group that can be somewhat profiled as a whole, you can have things like resistances and weaknesses built in. Of course, these are going to be kind of looser than general resistances and weaknesses. This isn't going to be weakness 5 to fire damage, but it'll be something more like someone is very upset that their child is missing, and if you can find that out and then bring it up in a influence encounter, then you might be able to further your goals better. They have a sample stat block here, which I won't go too deep into because I have some prepared for you. And then at the bottom here, they have a discussion of how to run an influence encounter, saying, as I did that generally you should be very open to improvisation, let people use diverse sets of skills whenever possible, let the PCs set the pace and choose who they interact with, keep the NPCs distinct, react to your PC's interactions, and just generally try to make it feel like an encounter rather than a series of skill checks. Of course, my demonstrations are not going to be the greatest at that because I'm role-playing with myself here, but we do what we can. And influence encounters as a type of social encounter are worth the same amount of XP as a social encounter would be, which is to say, you can equate it directly to combat encounters as far as XP goes. They're just taking a different form. And then I wanted to get a little bit into setting DCs here. It does not provide a lot of information here for you. It gives some generally very good advice about setting DCs in general, where you set DCs according to a social level and then apply modifiers such as hard, very hard, easy, incredibly easy, etc., setting a variety of skill checks so that people can excel in certain areas. But I wanted to point you towards some rules that could hopefully help with building these stat blocks a little bit better. The building creatures rules, it's an amazing set of rules that I highly recommend you go and check out if you're ever going to be building any kind of encounter, really, because this contains the tables for basically everything you could need when trying to run something, and being able to pick these up and eventually at some point be able to even quick reference them if you need a stat block of some kind on the fly is very, very helpful. But as for an influence encounter, the only things we're going to need is down here in the perception tab. You're going to want to pick a perception value. I would say generally go for the moderate value of an on-level creature. If you want the person to be just a standard person, go for high or anywhere from high to extreme if you want them to be very perceptive, and go for anywhere from low to terrible, generally around low though, if you want them to be very easy to lie to. And then the second thing you're going to want to select is going to be their saving throws down here under the defenses section. But specifically all you're doing here is will. And this is going to be how easy they are to influence. So perception is how easily they're going to pick up on being lied to, and will is going to be how easy it is to influence them. And again, same advice. Average creature, I would say somewhere around moderate, maybe leaning towards high or low, depending on if this is an encounter you particularly want your party to succeed at, and then otherwise go with the creature's temperament either towards high or low. I advise not using terrible or extreme modifiers in most circumstances unless you want something to be very, very hard. So, for example, maybe you want an encounter to be theoretically possible with, say, the captain of the city guard as the party is new to town, and instead of just using a very high level modifier, you could use the extreme modifier for on level, and that would keep things possible, but still very unlikely. Or terrible. Honestly, usually with terrible, I use this if no one in the party has access to anything that they would need to deal with a problem. But I still want the story to move forward in that direction. Otherwise, if you're going to be using these modifiers, I think generally people don't even need to be rolling for them at this point. And then finally, for the DCs, for discovery and influence, you're going to be referencing the level-based DCs table. This is your best friend. And then adjusting from there. I would recommend taking the level-based DC, modifying it by +2 or -2 to make the encounter easier or harder, and then from there, as your base DC, applying modifiers for other skills. And we can get into that right here with the examples I have prepared for you. So we're taking a little bit of a break from the fantasy world below. We are in the Starfinder setting with Mashri and Exxa here. Still just an alchemist and investigator. They have recently been going around this system in the Pact Worlds and have found a mysterious vault nearby this floating space whale station. The town is called Whalen, and they have made their way to the elected representative of the town, Easy Pete, and yes, this is a reference to Fallout, to attempt to gain access to the town's explosive supplies, to attempt to break into the vault that they have found outside of the town's perimeter, possibly attempting to, say, cut the town in on whatever is inside. And I also, before we move forward, want to shout out Zach Moeller for creating this battle map. Anyways, so they have arrived at the front door of Easy Pete, and Mashri has prepared ahead of time with some consumables. Mashri is the more charismatic of the two, and Exxa is the more observant, so he has prepared a serene mutagen. This is good for perception for Exxa, who will drink it before they walk in. And Mashri will be drinking a silver tongue mutagen, which gives bonuses to various social skills. And then additionally, Exxa has done some preparation beforehand with a couple of leads as an investigator. One of the questions under the case of the Starstruck Vault that is currently being pursued is what is inside that vault. This should be good enough to apply to anything here, because being able to gain the explosives would further the goal of finding out what's inside the vault. But just in case, I decided to provide an alternative question that Exxa could also pursue. How can we get into that vault? To be able to apply the investigation bonus from Pursue a Lead to the skill checks here. The two of them are going to make their way inside, having set up this meeting with Easy Pete, and now I'm going to go over the stat block for you. I tend to lead off with a short description of what's going on and the attitude of the NPC. So in this situation, I say this is a 5th level challenge. The party is trying to convince Easy Pete to allow them to use Whalen's explosive stock to access the vault. He doesn't care much for anything other than competence with the dangerous tools, and is very perceptive towards attempts to influence him otherwise, calling them out if they do so. He gives them an hour of 15-minute rounds, or 2 failed deception or diplomacy checks, whichever comes first. And then so that should give you some idea of how to run the encounter, the context around it, and kind of like a leading bit of role play with the calling them out if they do so, where if one of them were to make a check to try to simply sweet talk him into allowing them to use the explosives, he's going to point out that that's what they're doing. And that should help with characterization. And then below is the actual statistics. Easy Pete, his traits. He is a considerate station electee. He has slightly higher perception and will than a average creature at his level, to represent the fact that he is very perceptive and resistive. Discovery, so being able to discover information about the NPC that can aid with building up influence. You can do with either perception. You can do it easier with society, or the easiest with Whalen lore, being able to understand the context of the city, the station, will, of course, give you a lot of information and understanding him. As for being able to influence him, explosives lore will represent knowing what you're talking about, and thus has a DC of only 12, very, very likely to pass that one. DC 18 for crafting. It's still applicable to explosives, but is somewhat detached. Deception, a DC 19 to attempt to fool him into thinking that you know what you're talking about. Or DC 23 for diplomacy, which is just good reasoning, being good about talking about, say, the money, things like that. And then the thresholds at Influence 2. Easy Pete will give everyone enough explosives to loosen the lock, explaining that the best means for these tools is the least dangerous one. So he doesn't want to give away as much as he can. But the party wants to be able to blow their whole way in, and they think from some schematics that they dug up on a station earlier that there might be a second set of doors, so they're going to have to keep pushing. At Influence 3, he will give them enough explosives to blow the door fully off, but still wouldn't be enough if there was a second set of doors. And at Influence 5, he'll give them full access to the explosives as long as they don't abuse the privilege. As far as resistances and weaknesses go, Easy Pete is an empirical man, and appeals that do not demonstrate in some way understanding of explosives increase the check's DC by 3. And so this is where I want to get into real quick a aside about role-playing. The influence subsystem can very much so be used as a method of more in-depth role-playing, but I think that it is quite difficult to use the subsystem if your party is not already engaging in in-depth roleplay. I tried to emphasize in my social encounters video that the rules generally allow very well for people to just say, I'm going to do this check, and then they roll it and they get their result. And that can be very helpful for people who are not very easily able to improv or engage with roleplay or otherwise struggle with those aspects of the game. I do not think that the influence subsystem is particularly good at this. You can still find out resistances and weaknesses and things like this for influence games where people are not per se role-playing every single action they're taking, but it's going to be much harder, and I hope that that is well shown off with these examples here. Anyways, moving on. The weaknesses for Easy Pete is that he loves to talk about the mechanics behind explosives. It's something he's very interested in, very passionate about. You can gain trained proficiency in explosives lore until the end of this encounter by spending an influence round trying to get him to gush about it. And then it gives a little bit of background about the character in case they get a little bit more into roleplay and not purely what they're trying to accomplish. Easy Pete used to be a violent revolutionary in his childhood, wielding bombs against the injustices of his homeworld. He lost a lot of people and is extremely wary of causing the same. I would recommend, as usual with any kind of role-playing prompt, keeping it whatever you prefer, but I tend towards lighter kind of directions, and then you can take notes as you roleplay if this is going to be a recurring character. A little appearance, he's an old man with a straw hat and a stubbled gray beard. And then his personality should generally be kind, understanding, but firm. And then finally, you can toss on a penalty or any kind of special modifier to an encounter. In this case, any display of blatant irresponsibility causes Easy Pete to raise his guard, becoming impossible to influence by the offending creature. Generally speaking, this can give whatever creature you are having as your influence target be very characterized, I think would be the best word. It gives them mechanical implementation for the role-playing that you are kind of setting forth. Anyways, so yes, we will begin on round 1 here. Exxa is going to attempt to use discovery, having prepared for the day with the flexible studies feat, allowing you to become trained in one skill of your choice during daily preparations. Exxa had prepared on the day before as they were traveling towards the station with Whalen lore, and so we'll be using that to attempt to discover some information about Easy Pete here. And a 15 versus the DC of only 10 will be a success. And a success on discovery means you get to choose one of the following. Learn what skill that you can use to influence the NPC has the lowest DC. So when you are telling the players what the skills they are allowed to use are, and of course allow them to use other skills if it makes sense that they would be relevant. You do not want to tell them, however, what the actual DCs are. And so in this case, Exxa was going out on a limb and saying that the lore would likely have a much lower DC. But currently the party would only know that they can use explosives lore, crafting, deception, or diplomacy. And Exxa here could learn that explosives lore is the easiest skill by far. Or Exxa could learn one of the NPC's personal biases, one of their resistances, or one of their weaknesses. And in this case, personal biases would refer to the penalty listed at the bottom here. Although, more or less, that can refer to any kind of special characteristic that you have assigned. In this case, Exxa is going to go out on a limb and say that explosives lore, whenever a lore is listed, it's probably pretty decent, is probably going to be the lowest, and we'll use the question asking about weaknesses. And discovering that Easy Pete loves to talk about the mechanics behind explosives, Mashri will spend his round on this first round here learning explosive lore, up to trained. Now, we move on to round 2. The party still has no influence. Mashri is going to spend the round just using explosive lore. And unfortunately, the Silver Tongue mutagen is not going to be coming in handy here because it is specifically for trying to talk people into things, not explaining technical know-how. But a 27 is still going to be a critical success against the DC of only 12. And Mashri will rank up, or will collect up 2 influence points. Easy Pete at this point will promise the party enough explosives to loosen the lock, but no more. Exxa is going to attempt, we'll say, he's not trained in crafting. He's simply going to spend a round gaining training in explosives lore as well. Alrighty. So that is the end of round 2, and now moving into round 3, I'm going to remember that Exxa has a special feature called Clue In from Investigator. Once per 10 minutes, when another creature attempts a check to investigate a lead you're pursuing, so in this case, being able to use these explosive lore checks to attempt to influence Easy Pete is aiding in the investigation towards how can we get into the vault. You can grant them your bonus from Pursue a Lead. So Exxa is going to be using that on each of these rounds now because it is once per 10 minutes and these are 15-minute rounds. Mashri and Exxa will both make explosives lore checks to attempt to get Easy Pete over to their side. Mashri will have a success, pushing them up to the 3rd influence point and causing Easy Pete to promise them enough to blow the door off, but no more. And Exxa will have a very unfortunate roll, but will still succeed and gain a single influence point. This doesn't unlock anything new for them, though. And then we will move on, finally, to this 4th round of information, and it's probably all but sealed here, but let's just see it. Mashri will succeed, and that will mark the end of this influence encounter as they gain that 5th influence point. And Easy Pete gives them access to the full vault of explosives as long as they don't abuse the privilege. They'll continue to exchange pleasantries for a little while longer, but then they are going to head off and blow open that vault. And then we're going to skip forward a little bit. A few hours after they've left the station, it is rocked by a horrible, horrible screech. A gigantic monster tears through the town, destroying much of the structure built up on this space whale. And both Mashri and Exxa come racing back through space, chasing the creature, and it manages to dart off into space as Mashri throws some bombs and Exxa takes some slashes at it with his sword. The they end up being called to Easy Pete's home and are informed for this second example of an influence encounter that, and now I can get right into the example. 5th level challenge. The party's opening of the vault unleashed a horrid beast upon the town that they only just barely pushed back, and Easy Pete wants to call in the Packed World authorities to handle the situation. The party doesn't want this to happen because they are currently wanted for crimes they didn't commit. This is part of their backstory. Exxa and Mashri are currently on the run. Easy Pete cares deeply for Waylon, but with some aid from the others in the room, as some of the various villagers have crowded in here for safety, the party might be able to convince him. This is a 20-minute encounter comprised of 4 5-minute rounds. He has the same general statistics. His perception and will are another little bit higher. The party has access to discovery with perception, society, or Wayland lore, and they can influence him with Wayland lore, diplomacy, deception, or performance. And then they have thresholds at 2, 3, and 5. And they have no other information at this point. But I, as the GM, have the understanding of what these different influence thresholds will be. And I didn't actually edit their descriptions, but don't worry too much about that, because that's a good example of how we can make things up on the fly if need be. The resistances have been edited in this encounter to be any appeal to his emotions has its DC increased by 3, and that's if they're appealing to his emotions rather than the other people in the room. He has weaknesses where several well-loved Wayland residents actually have criminal records, and Pete calling the authorities for aid is a difficult choice. He's currently struggling with risk assessment between these two options, and so gaining this weakness allows you to decrease the DC for all checks that incorporate this fact into them by 5, so if they bring it up when trying to convince him. And then also as the GM, we have the modified penalty, where any displayed lack of care for Waylon causes him to raise his guard, becoming impossible to influence by offending creatures. Now we can get right back into rolling. In the first round here of 4, Exxa is going to be able to use Waylon lore to attempt to use discovery. And because this is now related to something other than what's inside the vault or how to get inside the vault, Exxa is no longer going to be benefiting from the Pursue a Lead investigation bonus. However, Exxa will still be making that Wayland lore check to discover. And a 24 versus the DC of 12 will be a critical success, meaning that Exxa will get to choose 2 options from below. Exxa will choose for weaknesses and which skill has the lowest DC. And we'll learn that it is going to be easiest to influence Pete using Wayland lore by appealing to the townsfolk that are in the room and getting them to talk to Pete instead. And we'll learn that the weakness is that if they incorporate the fact that several of the residents have criminal records, then they get to decrease the DC by 5. Exxa will share this with Mashri, who will then go ahead and spend his round attempting diplomacy to attempt to influence the townsfolk, convince them to talk to Pete. A 22 against the lower DC of 15 will be a success, and the party will gain a single influence point. And then we'll move on to round 2, where Exxa will continue to use Wayland lore. Again, a very good example of how being able to gain lore in something as an investigator can be very, very helpful. Exxa will be using that to convince the townsfolk. The modified DC of 12 means that a 25 will be a critical success, and that will gain the party 2 influence points and push them over 2 thresholds to the point where at influence 2, I would say Easy Pete would allow the Mashri and Exxa to leave, and then he would call in the authorities. Influence 3 is he will tell them that he was planning on ratting them out to the authorities, but is not going to. And let's see if they can get up to 5. Mashri says Mashri is going to ask if he can use his medicine instead of other skills to attempt to treat any injured people, to attempt to help. And I will say, go ahead for that, Mashri. And a nat 20 with a result of 31 against the modified DC. Generally, when you allow a DC, you want to go for the highest one unless there's something in particular that you want it to be closer to. In this case, I would have chosen the standard DC of 20, kind of in the middle, because that is a very thoughtful thing to do, and trying to convince Pete because he cares so much for the people. It makes sense. But that'll be a critical success, ending the influence encounter by getting them up to 5. They're going to be able to fully convince Pete to not get the feds involved, because they are going to go ahead and handle that beast. They're just going to need some help. And then we're going to move away from this adventure, as they're going to be collecting their other 2 party members from the town and then moving out to defeat that beast. Overall, though, I hope that this was a good overview of the influence subsystem in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I think it's very good for when you want to single out a group or a single NPC and kind of be able to build up progressive incremental successes against them, have a more detailed and nuanced encounter than the social encounters can allow. It does mean that people are going to have more role-playing specificity and perhaps more engagement in more improvisational ways during a session to take full advantage of the system. And I think that despite Paizo's recommendations for using this for a single creature and as a single encounter, I think this could very easily be implemented as well in a similar situation to a research subsystem, how that can be implemented where you can have it across the course of an entire adventure. So for example, rather than this entire subsystem, they could have had something they wanted from Easy Pete's, but they can't acquire an audience with him until they reached a certain threshold, say the influence 5. And then there could be various tasks that they could do along the space whale that would be able to gain them influence points by helping people with other things. It wouldn't be that they're making influence checks, but it would be that they would, say, go and capture a space cockatrice for a farmer. And in doing so, they would gain an influence point, or 2 influence points if the cockatrice was uninjured. Something like that. I think that there's a lot you can do with it. I think that even if your party is not particularly prone to in-depth roleplay and improvisational, emotional connection with NPCs, or if anyone's not comfortable with that, if it's difficult for you to run, there's still a lot of potential for this. I highly recommend using it in your next game, or even just experimenting with it. Have a little bit of fun. Toss it in where it is relevant. That's all from me, though, for today. I will see you guys next time. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you liked it. Subscribe if you want to see more. And I will see you next time. See ya. See ya.